Hi everyone, and welcome to the fifth instalment of What's Your Poison, organised by the HERA-funded research project Intoxicating Spaces. This week it's tobacco, and we're delighted to welcome as our speaker Dr. William Tullett. Will is a lecturer in history at Anglia Ruskin University. His research focuses on the history of feeling from 1600 to the present. His first project was on the history of smell, resulting in the monograph Smell in 18th Century England, A Social Sense, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2019. He's currently working on two projects, a history of sound and feeling in 18th century Britain, and a longer project on the senses, impairment and inequality from 1650 to the present. And he's also, as many of you will know, a lead on the wonderful Odoropa project funded by Horizon 2020, where he's working on converting smell data extracted from historical texts and images into storylines and narratives about Europe's olfactory past. So as ever, will speak for around half an hour, give or take, and there'll then be around half an hour for questions and discussion. There's a little chat feature on the bottom right where you're welcome to post constructive comments and observations throughout the talk. And we've just had some wonderfully good news from Carolyn on the arrival of a granddaughter, so congratulations, Carolyn. However, if you have a question for Will at the end, please post it using the separate Ask a Question button at the bottom. And you can pop these in as they continue throughout the talk, save them until the end. However, do be aware that the event is being recorded. So without further ado, it gives me massive pleasure to turn things over to Will and tobacco and the war of the senses.
Thanks very much, James, for the introduction. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. And I want to start by thanking James and the Intoxicating Spaces team really for inviting me to speak at this fantastic series. It's a real privilege to take part. And thank you to everybody that's tuned in. I hope that this talk is worth your time. So over the course of the next sort of 30 minutes, I want to discuss the multi and intersensory life of snuff in 18th century England. And actually, particularly in this talk, I actually want to focus on the site of snuff for reasons that will hopefully become clearer as we move on. Some of this material stems from the research from my first book, which James mentioned, on smell in 18th century England, A Social Sense, which I've been told hopefully is going into paperback in August this year. So fingers crossed it might be affordable at some point. And that has a whole chapter on tobacco. And in that chapter, I make some particular arguments about the relationship between smell and tobacco consumption in the 18th century. So I want to start by just very, very briefly outlining those for those who, the vast majority of people who may never have read my book. So in brief, the argument about tobacco and snuff in my book goes something like this. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, tobacco smoking had often been practiced in public venues, in theatre, theatrical, satirical texts and visual culture. It was often highly explicitly associated with metropolitan coffee houses. And here the clouded fumes of tobacco served to create an olfactory atmosphere that bound men together in conversation. And perhaps the most interesting example of this, or perhaps fanciful example of this, was from the 1727 text, The Man in the Moon, in which the author explained the lively character of coffeehouse discourse by reference to the hot and dry nature of the smell of coffee and tobacco, which, by entering the bodies of all the people in attendance, determined the emotional temperament of the venue. By contrast, these same texts often noted that the smell of puffing pipes excluded effeminate men and women from these spaces because supposedly they were held to abhor the smell of tobacco. And numerous sources, mostly satirical, also elaborated on wives' complaints about husbands that smoked like chimneys. Now, in the long 18th century, a new sensitivity to the problem of being private in public seems to have emerged. People became more anxious about maintaining a sense of personal space in public venues, especially but not exclusively mixed-sex ones. In the context of tobacco, this meant pipe smoking was shunned in many polite venues for its potential to create clouds of smoke, which others were forced to endure. In its place, snuff seemed the better option, since it delineated a more privatized, inward-facing way of consuming tobacco products. Where smoked tobacco created a cloud around the person, snuff was snorted straight into the nose, and the individual could choose their preferred scent and mixture. This was one example, I think, of a broader privatization of the public consumption of scent. Another example was the move away from pomanders and other strongly scented material culture like scented gloves that created powerful aromatic atmospheres in the 17th century to essence and smelling bottles that were simply held to the nose at 18th century balls, theatrical performances, and musical concerts. However, as we'll see in this talk, snuff presented a series of its own sensory problems when used in public spaces. And I don't want to just read out a chapter from my book for 30 minutes or repeat lots of material that you can find there. So in this talk, what I want to try and do is to examine the multi-sensory properties of snuff and the way in which seeing snuff could actually invoke the feeling of tasting, touching, hearing, and smelling it. So it's a slightly experimental talk. It might be a bit odd and it might not work, but we'll see if it does. My main source for this talk comes from magazines and periodicals and satirical texts, but there's one particular pamphlet that I want to use as a center point from which to radiate outwards. And so it's probably best that I start by explaining the title I've given for this talk and introducing the pamphlet that we'll be taking as our starting point. So what is the war with the senses? When was it? And what role does tobacco play in the conflict? In 1782, a wealthy wool stapler from Bermondsey, Richard Russell, issued a small pamphlet into the whirling world of late 18th century metropolitan print. An obituary of Russell, published in the London Magazine after his death 2 years later, described him as a short, corpulent man pitted with smallpox scars, who in many ways epitomised the stereotypical national character of the Englishman. An avid pedestrian who loved to walk the streets of London, Russell was described as blunt, honest, slightly idiosyncratic, and politically a great lover of freedom. Russell was an avid theatre goer, and at the time of his death he was supposedly also a candidate for fellowship of the Royal Society. However, the obituary noted he also possessed a kind of cynical turn which led him frequently to oppose the sentiments of others. Perhaps the oddest element of Russell's life was his funeral. Russell, a bachelor, arranged for 10 virgins to act as pallbearers, straying flowers behind his funeral procession as they went. Now, Russell's pamphlet seems to distill many of these different facets of his character into a single text. Love of sociability and urban perambulation, bluntness and cynicism, and, to modern sensibilities, a rather disconcerting admiration of virginal female beauty. Titled War with the Senses, or Free Thoughts on Snuff-Taking, Russell's pamphlet was an attack on snuff, but more specifically, it was an attack on female snuff-taking, from the pen of a self-professed friend to female beauty. Over the course of 21 pages, Russell attempted to list the profound problems that he associated with snuff-taking. It was an offence to all 5 senses, according to Russell, and so should be banished from society as an unnatural custom. In voicing these criticisms of snuff, Russell was highlighting many of the issues which other writers had raised and continued to raise over the course of the long 18th century when it came to snuff. And these are highly revealing, I think, of both the cultural role that snuff played and the relationship between the senses and sociability in 18th century culture. And in fact, what I want to do in this paper is try and, at least in part, to structure my discussion around some of the key topics around which our understanding of the 18th century and its culture clusters, including politeness, sensibility, and whiteness. But Russell's title, War with the Senses, illustrates how snuff became one of the many discomforting irritations of 18th century public life. And so I want to start with another element that's become important to 18th century historiography, the idea of comfort. Historians have zoned in on the 18th century as a moment when a new idea of comfort emerged. They have demonstrated that by the end of the 18th century, the daily material needs of the body had taken on a new priority in determining the organisation and, to some extent, the technologisation of domestic space. Lamps, stoves, candles, mirrors, and soft furnishings are among the things that made late 18th century homes increasingly comfortable. Attacks on tobacco smoking in the home and attempts by the better off to set aside particular parts of the house for smoking were part of this attempt to render domestic spaces more comfortable. And it's also worth noting that complaints about public smoking shared rhetorical tropes with the discourse of domestic comfort. So, for example, inefficient chimneys and pipe puffing raised the same spectres of smoky savagery, since attacks on both inefficient chimneys and pipe smoking both claimed that they turned homes into Hottentot kraals and wigwams, and we'll come back to that slightly racialized comparison later. But as it stands, the centre of the story of comfort is the home. But the body's needs for comfort extended well beyond the domestic sphere. And for examples, we could turn to the mirror image of the discourse on comfort, James Beresford's wonderfully irritable Miseries of Human Life. Published in 1806 to instant success, Beresford's characters ask, "What, my poor sir, are the senses but 5 yawning inlets to hourly and momentary molestation?" In Beresford's text, the enforced consumption of second-hand tobacco smoke in an important business meeting and the propensity of tobacco and snuff boxes to spill their brown, dirty contents everywhere both come in for criticism from the two characters, Timothy Testy and Samuel Sensitive. Crucially, though, the miseries described in the book were everywhere. Beresford's work contained chapters on travel, London, and public places of entertainment alongside domestic concerns. And it may well be that an awareness of the sensory irritations of public spaces may have helped develop a greater distinction between the domestic and the public. A rather telling comment in one diatribe against the use of snuff from 1804 suggests as much. The author of a letter to the editor of the Scots magazine noted that "Every man's house, Mr. Editor, is his castle. At home he may take as much snuff as he pleases, but against the admission of open snuff boxes into public rooms, I must enter into solemn protest." But here our complainant was not just drawing a distinction between private and public forms of consumption, but an analogy between the comfort of the home and the comfort of the body in public space. The author went on to suggest that keeping snuff in a pocket instead of a snuff box might in fact be preferable, since it constitutes only a personal fixed nuisance which you may escape by keeping out of its neighbourhood, whereas the moving social snuff box would always invade your senses. The language of nuisance here was telling because this term had a legal status, including in the rash of improvement acts that were attempting to cleanse and beautify British towns in the 18th century. One of the nuisances attacked by this legislation was the placing of private dunghills adjacent to or on public streets and highways in front of homes. It was therefore no accident that snuff's detractors bemoaned faces with a dunghill of snuff upon and complained that the handkerchiefs of snuff takers were little better than, quote, a portable dunghill. So both the mismanagement of the boundaries of the home and the boundaries of the body could invade the senses of the public and were censured by improving minds. But it's also the case that snuff and tobacco smoking in public encouraged feats of technological imagination just as much as domestic discomfort did, even if some of these technologies were never actually really used or made. A number of correspondents who were enraged by snuff taking suggested inventions that might better deal with snuff's obnoxious public impact. And one of these was a special box for snuff takers that, quote, the lid of which on opening exactly fits the capacity of his nostrils, so that the snuff went directly into the snuff taker's nose without disturbing the eyes, nose, or clothing of those around them. Others focused on the visual and gustatory impact of snuff, suggesting that snuff takers should, quote, at meal times have a screen flapping down over their nose and mouth, under which they might convey their food, as you have seen at the masquerade. If tobacco produced a war of the senses, it also encouraged a social industrial complex of ideas aimed at better defending the individual's sensory battlements against outside attack. Sadly, these kinds of contraptions were probably never built, but later satirical prints, such as this one of an imaginary revolving hat from the 1830s, suggests the kinds of weapons that people armed themselves with in the sensory conflict of sociability of which snuff was part. Now, I would argue that this reaction to snuff, and by extension the whole discourse around discomfort and the miseries of social life that emerge in the course of the 18th and early 19th centuries, can actually only be really understood when placed in the context of particular 18th century ideas about the way the senses worked. So to help us explain that, let's turn to another moment of snuff taking. In 1732, a writer for the Weekly Register described a stagecoach ride with a lady friend who was partial to snuff. The lady, quote, pulling out her snuff box between a beautiful finger and thumb, took a pinch, and the length and taperness of one and the whiteness of both so suddenly fascinated my eyes that I, imagining I had a mind to a pinch, she cautiously made me an offer, which I embraced. Now, we'll come to white hands later in the presentation, but the fact that the combination of white fingers and dark snuff fascinated the eyes of the writer is important, because fascination had a very particular meaning in the late 17th and 18th centuries, and slightly more particular one than it does today. fascination was a state of being enraptured, intoxicated, or bewitched, in which the senses were controlled and stupefied. And the most culturally resonant examples of the 17th and 18th century in discussions of fascination were the supposed powers of witches to emit pestilential spirits from their eyes, which is an idea that's still being mentioned in 18th century texts, even if it's not being taken seriously. And more seriously, the power of some animals, especially serpents, to fascinate, thereby paralyze, and subsequently devour their prey. The latter was a topic of regular discussion in natural history throughout the 18th century, and in both examples, the witch and snakes, smell and sight were mooted as plausible and interchangeable explanations for the capacity of actors to fascinate the senses. In both cases, the eyes or the body emitted particles of matter that impinged on the ocular or olfactory nerves and thereby caused fascination. So from this example of looking at somebody taking snuff, I want to make a point about the particular visual culture in which acts of snuff taking were centered. In the 18th century, seeing was not something you did, but something that happened to you. Since the medieval period, two different theories of visual perception had competed for attention. On the one hand were extremitist theories, in which the eye sent out rays that then alighted on objects and made them visible. On the other hand, there were intromitist theories in which rays came from objects and were received by the eye. The 18th century's optical theory, as elaborated by John Locke and Isaac Newton, was intromitist and highly material. According to Locke, particles of light entered through the window of the eye, and vision was the product of these, quote, little globules striking briskly on the bottom of it. There's even a nice quote where he talks about sight as being fairies batting tennis balls of light at people's heads, some of which enter your eyes and some don't. This corpuscular understanding of matter applied equally to other senses, including smell, which was produced by the emission of effluvia from objects that floated through the air and then acted on the olfactory nerves. These kinds of theories essentially meant that all of the senses could be explained in terms of being touched by material emanations. And I think this helps to explain the sometimes visceral reaction to snuff and other practices of consumption in 18th century social spaces. Russell's disquiet about snuff, which seems to have been mirrored by many other critics, did not come from merely noticing people taking it, but from a feeling that he was being subjected to snuff. His eyes were continually drawn against his will to snuff takers and their snuff taking, as dirty handkerchiefs, dusty top lips, and grimy hands quite literally forced themselves upon his vision in what he referred to as a nauseous spectacle. Like the fascinated eyes of the gentleman in the stagecoach, then, Russell was not in control of his gaze, but was made the object of snuff-taking women and the touches of snuff. The tactility of vision forced the consumption of snuff in a way through the eyes, but discussions of food, eating, and snuff also illustrated anxieties about how the commodity could unintentionally break down the barriers between bodies, between smell and taste, or between the nose and the mouth. Russell seemed to have held particular contempt for the use of snuff at the dinner table. He noted that his appetite was hurt by the formidable emanations that snuff caused in those that took it. Other critics made similar points. One essay on snuff takers from 1754 complained that, quote, if I drink tea with a certain lady, I generally perceive what escapes from her fingers swimming at the top of my cup. Whilst when he dined at a friend's house, he was, quote, sure to have as much rapis as pepper with my turnips. At the dinner table, then, snuff got everywhere, and this was at least in part because, as historians of manners have illustrated, the rise of individual cutlery to prominence at the 18th century dinner table was actually quite socially and geographically uneven. This meant that many people did still use their fingers when eating. The kinds of anxieties this produced are best summed up in Tobias Smollett's description of the supposedly rather backward manners of the average Frenchman. So he says, quote, a true-bred Frenchman dips his fingers, embrowned with snuff, into his plate filled with ragout. Between every 3 mouthfuls, he produces his snuff box and takes a fresh pinch. He then displays his handkerchief and in the use of both scatters his favours among those that sit near him. Even when using a fork, spoon or knife, the movement of the hands between the snuff box, the face, cutlery, glass and the napkin or handkerchief proffered a series of opportunities for the dispersal of remnants of snuff around the table. But these fears about food and snuff were at least partly directed not at dinner guests, but at servants, who in middling and upper-class households increasingly prepared food in separated kitchens unobserved by the gaze of their masters and mistresses. One of the anxieties found in diatribes on snuff was that by dirtying the faces and handkerchiefs of middling and upper-class men and women, it debased their social status and made them seem more like the filthy lower orders. As one 1754 essay remarked, "Whenever I see a lady thus besmeared with Scotch or Havana, I consider her as no cleanlier than the kitchen wench scouring her brasses and begrimed with brick dust and fuller's earth." Snuff in the kitchen pushed this threat even further. Snuff and the products of the sneezes of the lower orders might get into middle-class meals, so that their consumers knowingly or unknowingly ingested it. Further raging against snuff's invasion of palates, Russell advised, quote, "all those who suffer or permit their servants to use it to consider how they would like their cook to let the snuff box fall into the dripping pan and then baste their meat with it." In the case of cooks and pastry chefs, there was more to this fear, since it was well known that snuff impaired the sense of taste. As Dr. John Hill, who published a pamphlet cautioning against the immoderate use of snuff in 1761, noted, inveterate snuff takers were likely to totally lose this delicate sensation of flavours. One explanation of this, mooted in another pamphlet on the abuse of tobacco from 1720, was that snuff often fell upon the tongue when spat out, and by hitting against the tongue made it, quote, more callous or hard and contracted, and by consequence made less capable to perceive an impression from the particles of our food. So the same corpuscular particulate explanation of snuff's impact that worked with sight and smell also explained its impact on taste. When Russell asked his readers whether they, quote, can have a good appetite for the pastry when known to be made by a snuff taker, he was not just referring to fears of contaminated food, he was also making the point that a chef's palate would be incommoded by snuff, and their ability to sagaciously season their food might also snuffer. Haha. It is perhaps no accident that the Dalis, who published prints of fashionable men known as macaronis in the 1770s, depicted a fashionable French cook who took snuff as he cooked. Numerous cultural critics in the second half of the 18th century developed the physician George Cheney's views about the deleterious impact of what Cheney referred to as high sauces, aromatics, delicacies, and fine flavours on the human body. The impact of Frenchified cuisine, according to some medics and cultural critics, was to slowly deprave people's taste until the individual, quote, cannot relish a diet which is not seasoned by art. Snuff-hardened tongues would be unable to distinguish subtle tastes, and this would cause, these critics suggested, a desire for ever more piquant and pungent dishes, a kind of gustatory arms race which would produce the mutually assured destruction of the taste buds. Snuff did not just deprave and desensitize the taste buds, though, it also confused the proper role of the senses. 18th century advice manuals on proper behaviour at the dinner table made a point of censuring those who made a show of smelling their food before eating it, and in the late 18th century the same works advised against taking snuff at the table. But snuff drew attention to the grunting, sneezing nose at dinner, and that numerous critics of snuff derided it as a form of feeding the nose illustrates the anxiety about mixing taste and smell. The idea of feeding on smells was an old one. Since Pliny into the medieval and early modern periods, travel writers had talked of peoples in Africa and India that fed using their noses instead of their mouths, an idea that had its basis in sound humoral medical theory. By the 18th century, the idea that smells could offer nutrition had been cast aside, but this didn't stop authors from associating feeding the nose with fantastical non-Western cultures. In his novel Mammoth, published in 1789, William Thomson described a people in the inner parts of Africa who lived on smells instead of food. The idea that snuff-taking was a form of feeding the nose therefore continued to contribute to anxieties about the incivility of the custom. As one author ruminated in 1791, it is so strange a practice to feed the nostrils with dirty pungent dust, a practice that the author argued had been imported into England from the Hottentots at the Cape of Good Hope. This racialized discussion of snuff brings us back to whiteness and hands. For Russell, in fact, it was white skin which snuff threatened to dirty the most. In particular, he emphasized the dirty, grimy quality of the brown powder which set against white women's skin. It was a regret to see a woman, Russell argued, with fine natural colouring of the features, pull off a glove and with a fine white delicate hand take out a box and put her pretty thumb and finger into a nasty coloured powder and apply the same to a beautiful face and spoil it by changing the fine natural colour of the skin in more places than where this filthy drug is laid on. Russell's anxieties were indicative of the broader cultural function that snuff fulfilled. This relationship is indicative of the role of quotidian commodities played in constructing whiteness in 18th century Britain. A number of scholars have described the use of racialized tropes in 18th century tobacco advertising, in particular on shop signs and trade cards. In the 17th century, anxieties about the potentially transformative impact of breathing in foreign commodities like tobacco, and therefore the cultures and the bodies of others, could be found in many treatises attacking tobacco. A 1616 pamphlet by John Deacon was among a number of texts that emphasised the ability of tobacco to turn bodies black from the inside out, describing tobacco as entrails foul blackness and bodies brave dire. But whilst the visual and textual cultures of tobacco smoking constructed ideas of blackness, snuff was implicated very explicitly in the construction of whiteness. Angela Rosenthal has noted that in the course of the 18th century, portraiture moved away from using black pages as a foil against which white aristocratic skin could be defined. Instead, whiteness acquired an autonomous visual code in portraiture in the form of transparent white skin and the virtuous rosy blush, so there was no need to use black servants to create that contrast. Similarly, the consumption of snuff performed the work of constructing whiteness without the need for explicit visual references that were found in the trade cards or advertisements that linked racist stereotypes and tobacco. As it was consumed, brown snuff formed an inviting contrast with the alabaster skin of the English gentlewoman. As Kate Smith has demonstrated, 18th century England was a society in which white hands took on the burden of signifying the presence of virtue, femininity, and ultimately resources, as well as the absence of physical labour. Recipe books and trade cards testified to the wide variety of ways in which women could whiten their hands, including powders, creams, ointments, and soaps. Alongside playing at cards or handling tea sets, which Kate Smith discusses, the use and offering of snuff was another way in which women could display the English genteel whiteness of their hands in daily sociability. A 1749 poem titled A Young Lady's 6 Reasons for Taking a Pinch of Snuff listed this as the 4th chief reason for snuff's use. The hand like alabaster fair, the diamond sparkling pride, can never so gracefully appear if snuff should be denied. The fashionable male fop, later beau, was also accused of handling the snuff box in order to show the whiteness of his hand. It was even suggested that some men took snuff in order to show off the whiteness of their arms and hands, not by contrast necessarily with the dark brown dust, but because by holding their arms in an upright position for long enough, they could effectively drain the blood downward from their arm and, as one magazine article in the 1760s put it, procure an artificial blanching. But as Russell's anxiety suggests, the use of snuff also troubled the boundaries of whiteness that it was implicated in supposedly managing. To simplify things somewhat, 18th century theories of race before the emergence of biological racism revolved around ideas about climate in which the heat of the sun was one element in transforming the skin. Snuff, some writers suggested, could have the same impact. Critics were anxious that the complexion of a well-bred woman would take a tinge from constant snuff taking, and it's telling that one author compared this to, very explicitly, to, quote, being tanned or freckled by exposing their delicate faces to the scorching rays of the sun. However, it was not just the dirtying qualities of snuff that Russell and other critics attacked. There were other sources for their concern about snuff's impact on the female face. We've already noted how by the second half of the 18th century, the representation of femininity in portraiture centered on a combination of transparent white skin and the virtue signaling blush that emerged from underneath. This was linked to shifting codes of behavior in public space. Early 18th century politeness often focused on dissimulating and disguising feeling in order to make yourself agreeable to the company. But with the rise of sensibility over the course of the 18th century, greater value was placed on the outer display of inner feeling in social situations. In this context, what defined whiteness and made it special according to 18th century aesthetics was its capacity for emotional legibility. This is what distinguished white and black bodies, according to Uvedale Price in his 1796 essay on the picturesque, in which he said, "No Ethiopian poet could say of his mistress, her pure and eloquent blood spoke in her cheeks and so distinctly wrought that you might almost say her body thought." This helps explain Russell's anxieties about the impacts of snuff. Wherever this filthy drug was laid on, Russell argued, it caused, quote, the blood to rise into the face. Russell was not unusual in citing this as a problem. Another writer from the 1790s observed, "How different are the complexions of our London females since they have discarded the snuff box, how pure the lily of the neck and the damask of the cheek." In other words, snuff was a problem not only because it interfered with the transparency of the facial canvas by dirtying it, but also because it made the relationship between inner feeling and its outer visceral representation in the blush unreliable by causing the blood to rush to the face. Snuff made the female face, and therefore female feeling, feeling and emotion, less legible for male observers. The role of snuff in making the face difficult to read is further exemplified by Russell's comparison between snuff taking and grinning. Russell refers to issue 173 of The Spectator, published in 1711, which described the phenomena of grinning in great detail. Grinning could refer to an open-mouthed smile or the baring of teeth in anger. In the early 18th century, such an expression was often seen as a mark of animality, rusticity, and even madness. But grinning could also refer, as it did in the Spectator essay, to the practice of generally making unusual, fantastical, or exaggerated expressions with the face. Russell warned that snuff elicited similarly exaggerated expressions from the snuff taker, and they should be aware of the alteration it makes in their countenance. Satirical images of snuff takers often attempted to capture these unusual facial expressions that were part and product of taking snuff. And if I'd had time, I would have inserted several examples of those into the PowerPoint, but unfortunately I ran out of time. In particular, Russell had a problem with the eyes of snuff takers. He noted that we see the eyes of many people before sniffing up the snuff, and immediately after, even if it doth not make their eyes water, receive ultimate detriment by an unnatural convulsion of the optic nerve. And I think here we can understand Russell's reaction in terms of the 18th century theory of optics that we referred to close to the beginning of this talk, in which material rays proceeded from things into the receiving eye. That unnatural convulsion of the optic nerve is not just in the eye of the snuff taker, but by intromission in Russell's eyes too. His fear is that snuff's demands on his vision will end up destabilizing his own sight, resulting in a similarly problematic facial response. And I want to finish very briefly by suggesting that what made all of this visual illegibility and confusion particularly problematic was that it also interfered with ways of looking that were important to long 18th century sociability. In 1804, an attendant at a set of university lectures complained of his distracted mental attention and the violent emotion produced by snuff being passed along his row of seats, consumed and then wiped away by handkerchiefs, the hues and sense of which it would beggar the powers of description to detail, according to him. A churchgoer in 1807 similarly complained that the sneezing, hawking, spitting, etc. shall maintain such an uninterrupted noise and commotion in church that the intelligent few shall lose at least 1/3 of the sermon. In venues where watching and listening were key, snuff presented particular problems. And this included the theatre. In the second half of the 18th century, this interfered with expectations about audience behaviour. Throughout the 18th century, seeing and being seen was integral to audience experience. In the first half of the period, attention to musical and theatrical performances was often more limited. People chatted, arrived late, left early. They were just as likely to be gazing at other audience members as they were to be looking at the stage. In the second half of the 18th century, a slow and faltering change in behaviour began, in which greater silence and attention was expected from audiences, and this really picks up in sort of from the 1780s onwards. Here, observing the emotional reactions of other members of the audience assumed a greater importance, as did the focus on a silent, inward-facing appreciation of one's feelings. The combination of the sight and sound of snuff-taking interfered with the visual logic of theatre in both parts of the 18th century. As one writer put it, the theatres continually echo with the music of the nose, and the most pathetic speech in a tragedy has been interrupted by the blowing of noses in the front and side boxes. As this suggests, it was not just the ability to hear that was compromised here. The eyes were distracted, pulled to the boxes to find the source of offending, sneezing, snuffling, or spitting. In conclusion, then, on this slightly rambling tour through Richard Russell's denunciation of snuff, in my book, I talk a lot about the relationship between smell and snuff, and I try to suggest that it offered a more privatized olfactory experience than smoking. And in doing so, I do briefly discuss the kind of multi-sensory capacity of snuff to offer offence in other ways, despite perhaps being less problematic to the nose than tobacco smoking. But in doing so, I think I probably underestimated the degree to which snuff's consumption and the offence it might cause was highly intersensory. By seeing snuff takers, their snuff boxes, their handkerchiefs, and the snuff itself, one was essentially seeing smell, taste, touch, and sound too. And this is partly because in the 18th century, the senses shared that common framing as products of intromission of particles of matter. This was a period before the separation of the senses that occurred in the aesthetics and physiology of the mid to late 19th century, and people therefore understood their worlds in far more intersensorial ways. The 18th century in the 18th century, the whole act of sensing was rooted in an understanding of what we now might call, in terms borrowed from the new materialists, vibrant matter. It's the theories of vision that we touched on near the beginning of this paper that helped to make sense of the common rhetoric of being touched by sights in 18th century discourse. And we often talk about 18th century sociability in theatres, pleasure gardens, and balls and coffee houses as centering on seeing and being seen. But it's not often noted that the power of vision in these contexts came from its tactile capacity to evoke all the senses at once just through vision. The ability of snuff to offend depended on the idea that by seeing snuff, the snuff was really seeing itself into you. And there I will stop on that slightly portentous final sentence.
Will, thank you so much for that incredibly sophisticated and thought-provoking talk. You said at the beginning you were sort of wondering if it would work. I think it worked absolutely splendidly. So many sort of important correctives there. I love this idea of snuff as a form of sort of visual passive smoking, coming in through the eyes. Yeah, love the connections between sort of fascination, intoxication, and witchcraft, and even bringing in sort of food history at sort of one point, and the effect of sort of snuff and tobacco on taste, which made me think about I think it's a current vogue for sort of the use of tobacco as a flavouring. I saw a video the other day was tasting tobacco flavoured ice cream. But yeah, fantastic. Enough from me. We've got some questions and comments lining up. The first one is from Peter, who asks, did the virtue of whiteness not predate snuff taking in England?
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly did. I think we sort of alluded to that in the presentation, really. That in the 17th century too, the virtue of whiteness was important to modes of self-presentation and things like portraiture. My point is really that snuff offered a very different way of demonstrating whiteness. And that in some ways it's kind of analogous with what Angela Rosenthal has talked about with portraiture, where portraits in the late 18th century no longer rely on the very explicit contrast between white skin and black skin, but instead rely on whiteness itself, and particularly the blush, to demonstrate kind of white femininity. In the same way, I think snuff is kind of allowing you to perform whiteness, if you like, without the need for that explicit contrast with non-white bodies, if that makes sense. And really, that's kind of picking up on, as I said, some of the work that Kate Smith has done in a context that's less explicitly about race, but nonetheless about the importance of things like black basalt teapots, for example, in the ability to kind of show off the white hand. So I think you're right. I think Peter's absolutely right. It does predate the 18th century. It's just that the 18th century and its commodity cultures offers new ways of performing that whiteness.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. Lots of interesting and appreciative comments in the side column. One from Tasha Marks in particular says she loves the idea of snuff seeing you. Yeah, I also thought that was very striking. And Melissa in the question box says it's fascinating how many of the objections to tobacco are still voiced: hawking, spitting, going black from the inside, and so on. Do you have any sort of thoughts on these sort of continuities, Will?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a lot of my initial thoughts about the kind of continuities come from comparison with the way we treat smell and the invasiveness of tobacco and smoking more generally today. I think it's really telling that despite the popularity of vaping, one of the things that people find most offensive about vaping is the smell and the capacity of that smell to invade your personal space, which I think is really interesting because, the suggestion has often been that tobacco, that banning smoking in public spaces in the UK, for example, the battle was won on the basis of the health messaging. And yet I think for a lot of people, I don't think it was the health messaging that really mattered, at least kind of my anecdotal experience. It was more about that feeling of the invasiveness of tobacco smoke, which was as much olfactory as it was about health. So it would be interesting to know how we might respond if tobacco smoking was completely inodorous. You know, how would our sense of it might be that it might have been banned earlier because people couldn't tell when there was tobacco when there wasn't tobacco. But on the other hand, it might not have caused the same degree of offence. It's a slightly pointless counter historical game to play there, but I think it's interesting to reflect on.
Oh, absolutely, and particularly the fact that, I mean, I've spent during lockdown a lot of time with the vapor, and the fact that a lot of the vape smoke doesn't smell of tobacco at all. It actually smells of sort of foodstuffs. It comes up with these sort of different flavours, which I think is quite interesting. So, yeah, thanks for that, Melissa.
And actually, sorry, just to add, James, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think actually it's the smelling like food stuff that people find problematic, because in the same way that people are anxious in the 18th century about snuff getting into their food, it's that category miscategorization, you know, of things falling into the wrong categories, of being kind of dirty in kind of Mary Douglas's anthropological terms. You know, it's matter out of place. And I think maybe that's, you know, in some ways that's why people find vaping even more problematic than smoking, because they expect smoking to smell a certain way, whereas vaping can smell like anything.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So Tricia Starks has a question. She says, thank you for an outstanding and exciting presentation. And she asks, can you speak more to the question of the sensory transgression of snuff, evoking response in others, against the questions of the urban environment and personal space?
What more can I say? I mean, I think I've kind of tried to list as many of the different ways in which snuff transgressed people's sense of personal space. I think it's interesting. One thing that I didn't really mention is the fact that snuff can be incredibly fine, right? It can be coarser, but it can also be incredibly fine. And one of the things I didn't mention, but I planned to talk about in the initial talk, was about the production of snuff. And Bernardino Ramazzini, in his excellent treatises of diseases of tradesmen in 1705, talks about tobacco makers. This is kind of really the first major occupational health text in Europe, really. Gets translated into English in 1705. It's published in the late 17th century in Italy. And that talks quite a lot about the kind of the fineness of the particles of snuff going into the air, and that being a real problem for people that make snuff. But also he suggests that the neighborhoods around these areas where snuff is made, I think he's suggesting that often snuff is being made outside, at least in Italy, and that there are these clouds of this stuff kind of go into the neighborhood around them so that everybody can smell it. Now, I haven't seen or smelled many references to that in 18th century texts on England, but it's quite interesting. And I think to some extent those anxieties about particulate matter and about dust, then go on to shape ideas about the offensiveness of trades in the late 18th and early 19th century. And indeed, Charles Thackeray, famous Leeds physician, is saying similar things about the manufacture of tobacco as well. So that's one kind of aspect that I didn't really talk a lot about. But I think the other one that I didn't mention quite as much as I'd like to is the fact that tobacco, kind of spilling tobacco and kind of tobacco getting onto people's clothes as you walk through streets, which is a really common thing that gets referenced in lots of 18th century texts. And I think really is linked to a kind of anxiety about being touched by the city and its spaces that's particularly obvious in the earlier part of the period in the writings of people like Ned Ward and also John Gay's Trivia, which is all about kind of avoiding the touch of the city to a certain extent and how to avoid it. So I think that's another really interesting aspect of that story.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tricia. Phil Withington says, thanks for a very engaging paper. You'll know that tobacco as smoke was recognised as potentially addictive in the sense of creating physical dependency in the 17th century. And he wonders if the new kind of assault on the body represented by snuff prompted further reflection on bodily responses and needs, including addiction, in the long 18th century.
Yeah, I think. Thank you for that's a really good question. And I think it really comes back to, now actually kind of circles back round to some of those ideas about 18th century thoughts on the senses and the way the senses work, and this idea that the senses are kind of enthralled to their environment. Actually, the senses are kind of in some ways passive, and the environment is acting on you all the time in ways that really, really take away your agency. And I think that also fits into those ideas about habit and custom, which are the two words that come up again and again and again in discussions of snuff in the 18th century. The idea that one of the things that Richard Russell talks about is the fact that people often say, well, I just do it by custom now. I've just got used to it. I can't shake it off. And he kind of says, well, if we said that about all customs, then how would we ever improve ourselves as a nation, or as a people, which is quite interesting. So I think snuff fits into those kinds of debates about reform and improvement, and is a kind of a satirical example that sometimes floated out in those areas of 18th century print. But I think also it comes up quite a lot in works on aesthetics when people are talking about habit and the way in which habit operates on the senses and custom operates on the senses, and in particular in comparisons between Britain and the rest of the world. And the kind of, I think that's why you see the idea of the Hottentot come up again and again in 18th century discussions of snuff. The idea that societies develop these quite disgusting customs, but they're just justified because they're customs, they're habits. So basically what I'm trying to say is it's everywhere. That idea is everywhere in all of the sources that I look at. It's not something that I talked about a lot, but I think there's something to be said about what it tells us about 18th century attitudes to habit and custom. Definitely.
Brilliant, thank you, Phil. Lav has almost sort of a practical question here. Were two separate handkerchiefs used due to snuff stains? For example, was one used for snuff exclusively, and was another reserved for other bodily functions?
It's funny you say that. One of the sources that I was looking at yesterday did talk about snuff takers having two separate handkerchiefs. One to do the kind of initial wipe, so to speak. And that they kind of sneezed the contents of their nose into, and then one that did the kind of nicer cleanup afterwards, just to make sure everything was okay. So you do get a sense that people are using multiple handkerchiefs, but there are also lots and lots of people saying that snuff takers are using. There's one guy that says that somebody's handkerchief looked like it had been used by whole generations of snuff takers, and rarely, if ever, cleaned. So yes, I think people are sometimes using multiple handkerchiefs, but also there are examples seemingly of people just using the same handkerchief again and again. Certainly one of the quotes in the paper was about this idea that your handkerchief became a portable dunghill, and that's actually from a diary from somebody in the late 18th, early 19th century who's trying to quit snuff, and one of his chief anxieties is the state of his handkerchief. So I think that's quite interesting and worth noting as well. So people, even snuff takers, are concerned about their slovenly appearance in that regard.
Brilliant, thank you, Lav. Jack Dijkstra has a very sort of large methodological question. He says, thanks so much for a fascinating presentation. He has a question of method. To what extent do you think the history of the senses should be married with the history of emotions to access histories of experience? I think Will's definitely your man for that one, Jack.
Yeah, well, I've got lots and lots of views on that, and we don't have time for me to express them all here. Sensory history has, by and large, been the less dominant of the two. History of emotions has really taken off, I think, in a way that sensory history has perhaps lagged behind slightly. And I know that Mark Smith and Rob Boddice have recently published a Cambridge Element all about how we should reintegrate histories of emotions and the senses. And to some extent, I'm very, very sympathetic to that idea. I think one of the points that I'm trying to make in this paper is that actually, 18th century people have this view of the senses in which smell and taste and sight are incredibly kind of interchangeable, and which all experience is incessantly intersensory, and that's because of the particular ways in which they understand the senses to work, and that kind of intersensory experience is also kind of deeply enmeshed with the emotions or the passions as well. So I think I don't think there's any problem with integrating the history of emotions and the senses. I think it's something we should absolutely do. I think one of the issues is that the sensory history has been very under-theorized. The history of emotions, you could argue, has been over-theorized. And I think so maybe sensory historians have something to learn from historians of emotions. On the other hand, I think historians of emotions have a lot to learn from sensory historians, particularly in the sense that sensory historians are much more aware of the problem of talking about the historicization of embodiment, and the way in which we talk about the history of the body and the way in which we use sources to that effect. And often in our discussions of theorizations of the history of emotions, and I think also in Mark Smith and Rob Boddis's recent book, the question of actual source material is kind of one that's kind of left unexamined to a significant degree. Whereas I think sensory historians are much more willing to just kind of be satisfied that they're just cultural historians and that's fine, and we're just practicing cultural history, because they've tried and played with the idea of accessing the body, but really it comes back to language and the text so often. Anyway, those are very jumbled thoughts, partly because I have a lot of them and I could speak for a very long time about this, but I'm going to stop there.
Brilliant, thank you, Jack. Neska Pfeiffer has a question. She says, "Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Did you find in your research that there was mention of the deleterious impact of snuff on the nasal cavity with prolonged use?" So a sort of history of medicine angle there.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's plenty of references to kind of polyps and all kinds of nasty formations within the nasal cavity, and damages to the hairs and damages to the and sort of clogging up the hairs within the nose. The most memorable quote is probably about somebody talking about these kind of polyps as like maggots dropping out of the nose. Sorry, I just realised James gone to drink his tea at that point. The best moment to say that, but that's, you know, that's the most memorable quote for me, and so I think people are aware of this. But I think there's a medical shift in the way people talk about snuff. It's the most important thing to bear in mind, which is that at the beginning of the 18th century, snuff is very much valued for its ability to take things out of the head, take things out of the brain, to unblock the nose, to kind of, you know, just all the sneezing that it's encouraging. That's good for you, right? You know, and that's partly bound up with the kind of inheritance of a humoral way of thinking, in which it's good to unblock the body in various ways that we won't go into here. By the end of the 18th century, people are much more worried about blocking up the nose with snuff, but also kind of overstimulating the sense of smell and the senses more generally, and that being really, really problematic. And also, I think also worried that not only about blocking up the nose, but perversely also making the nose incredibly porous, because stuff will be dropping out of it all the time. So there's certainly a shift over the course of the 18th century in terms of how people think about the medical uses of snuff. And I think that's partly bound up with a greater awareness of what it's doing internally to the nasal cavities as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Neska. I suppose I had a question while we're just sort of waiting to see if there are any more to come into the box about, I guess I'll just sort of call it wither snuff boxes. I know a lot of stuff in sort of material culture sort of studies by Angela and others has sort of looked at sort of snuff boxes and tobacco boxes. I mean, where would sort of they feature in this sort of sensory, particularly sort of this visual account? Are certain types of sort of snuff box seen as sort of better than others?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I wouldn't want to dive too much into that area, because, as you say, there are people who are much more accomplished and much better able to talk about it than I am. But I think certainly one of the points is that the snuff, well, there's a number of points you can make. One is that snuff boxes, and especially elaborate ones, draw the eye to the hand even more. So they are, you know, they're part of that gestural assemblage that directs the eye, and I think that's quite important. The second point is that the problem that people have with snuff boxes, or at least some of the critics seem to have with it, is people passing around open snuff boxes. So kind of opening the snuff box, giving it to your friend, and then it gets passed around, so that this snuff is kind of getting everywhere and people can smell it. That people have a problem with that, and that's why in one case, which I mentioned in the paper, somebody says in some ways it'd be better just have it in your pocket, because you can't pass around your pocket. So that's another. Although, of course, another comment that people make about snuff is that their snuff boxes are constantly unlatching in their pockets and spilling the snuff everywhere as well. So, you know, malfunctions of the snuff box, but also the intentional uses of the snuff box, I think are bound up with that kind of fear of visual and therefore multisensory contamination.
Super, thank you, Will. So I don't know if there are any more questions. If there are, speak now or forever hold your peace. It doesn't look like there are, and we're coming up to the witching hour, almost running out of time. So I think it just remains for me to say thank you so much to you all for coming, and particularly to Will for an absolutely fascinating talk that was sort of written especially for us. As he said, he didn't just sort of recycle material from the book, and indeed went back and revisited some of the conclusions of the book, which I think is an enormously generous thing to do. So thank you so much for that, Will. We'll be back in a fortnight when Hannah Halliwell from Birmingham will be talking about representations of morphine in 19th century French art. I've just put the registration link for that on the screen, so we hope to see you there. And Phil's just put in the question box, he says Angela McShane has a nice article on snuff boxes, gifting and inscribing coming out, which is potentially a point of intersection.
And also a great piece in History Today as well. If you could dig that out, I think she did a really good piece in History Today about this as well.
Absolutely.
Can I just ask very quickly, James, if people are interested in actually hearing my thoughts about the history of the senses and the history of smell and kind of the direction in which it's going, there is a talk next week that I'm giving about that topic, which I'm happy to share the link with in the chat if that's all right, James.
By all means, absolutely. Link away.
I'll just post that there. So yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah, we hope to see you at that, as well as with us in 2 weeks' time. So yeah, thanks everyone, and particularly thanks again to you, Will. Wonderful stuff. Cheers, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.